The next section is titled, He Got Me Started, Loyd Smith, May 29, 1987. What had been a fired .38 special case of no more use than a spent .22 rimfire hull had been resuscitated in a few effortless steps to life as a shootable round of ammunition. It was only slightly less miraculous than the parting of the Red Sea. I will never forget the awe when I pulled that round, my first ever reload, from Loyd Smith's massive Hollywood Universal turret press, nor the delight at being able to shoot tin cans in my bride's .38 special with ammo that cost less than .22 rimfire. Jay and I had just gotten married, which, as this is written, will be 31 years tomorrow, and we had made our first trip to her family home in Pecos, Texas. We had gone by Pecos Sporting Goods to buy a box of .22s and began talking with the owner. Loyd suggested we get into hand loading, which I don't think either of us had ever heard about, though we'd each received our first guns when we were 9. He invited us to come out to his house at nearby Barstow, where he showed us how to reload on that Hollywood. At the time, I didn't appreciate all its features: 12 die holes, plus 4 priming rams, and 4 shell holders, all set up for instant use. The cost for a new one, as equipped, was almost as much as a Browning over and under, or 3 K-frame Smith & W's. Then Loyd took us tin can shooting on the nearby desert. We shot probably 150 or 200 rounds, more centerfire than I'd ever shot in one outing. It was mind-boggling. That experience was the beginning of a lifetime love affair with handloading, and a lifetime friendship with Loyd Smith. When we went to Pecos, which was fairly often until we left Texas, I always spent time in Loyd's shop, and we often worked behind the counter when customers were thick, as they were in something season, when Mexican temporary farm workers would crowd into the store to buy ammunition and try unsuccessfully to buy guns. The ammo would be used for the barter back in Mexico, where it was extremely valuable due to Mexico's gun laws. It was legal for Loyd to sell them. It was legal for Loyd to sell them guns, but he would never do it, both to keep the probably cowboys out of trouble with the Texas law, and because he knew the guns and most of the ammunition would be confiscated at the border. Loyd and I didn't see each other very often in recent years, but Jay always stopped by when she visited her family, and Loyd and I talked on the phone occasionally. He sold handloader and rifle in his store, and he sold Gun Week when I was the editor, and he supported the Firearms Coalition, my lobbying efforts on Capitol Hill. He took defense of our gun rights seriously, and one trip to Pecos, Jay laughingly told me about Loyd's upset when he discovered, minutes before daughter Julie left on her honeymoon, that she had just married an anti-gun preacher. I later learned that the new husband wasn't really anti-gun, but is a senior in Christian college, full of faith that Loyd would take care of him and his bride. He staunchly refused Loyd's offer to carry along his stub-nosed .38 on the honeymoon. Loyd wasn't about to let that guy take his daughter anywhere. As a compromise, the newlyweds agreed to take Julie's nylon 66 .22 rifle, and Loyd agreed to let them go. Late in the afternoon of February 12, 1987, someone killed Loyd. He had rung up a small sale when the customer pulled a .357 Magnum and shot him. The 125 grain bullet hit him in the shoulder. Loyd turned and ran for his office, where he kept the only loaded gun in the place. The killer shot him in the back just as he reached the office door, killing him almost instantly. The killer then scooped about $90 out of the open cash register drawer and fled. In a little over an hour, the news was on the local radio. By midnight, the police had taken more than 200 statements and were able to begin the process of trying to identify every car that had been parked in front of Pecos Sporting Goods that day. In a small town, everybody knows everybody else, and their cars, the folks driving by Loyd's unconsciously noticed who or what strange car had visited his store. Everyone knew Loyd. He had operated his store since 1949. He had been constable at Barlow for 21 years and had served for 20 years on the Barstow School Board. The funeral procession was 5 miles long. Most of the folks around Pecos loved him. One didn't. Loyd's widow, Frances, established a scholarship with the cash. Contributions made in his name and is helping 2 Pecos High School seniors go to college this fall. His son, Lyndon, not named for Lyndon Johnson, but named Munch, regretted by Loyd's father after Johnson became president and turned anti-gun, quit Texas A&M, where he was a senior, to come home and run the store. Loyd had been trying to find a buyer for the surprisingly prosperous gun shop for 5 years, but potential buyers must have known that it wouldn't do so well without Loyd. So Lyndon, in the process of shutting down the store so he can finish his degree, is in the process of shutting down the store so he can finish his degree. The people of Pecos and Barstow, the local police, and the Texas Ranger, who was Loyd's friend for years, want his killer. They have reported, sniffed out, and sifted through countless clues, and they have suspects, though not under arrest. The police are treating the case primarily as a robbery murder, but some of us wonder if it may have been someone who Loyd refused to sell a gun. I think it's a good guess, for I've seen him do it. This time, it probably wasn't some poor who kindly Loyd was trying to keep out of trouble, but some bad actor who Loyd didn't think should have a gun. But that guy already had one. That kind already does. This time, they didn't just create another statistic. They took a friend, the guy who got me started in handloading and who indirectly launched me on a career that eventually took me to the gun magazines and finally to Washington, D.C. I've heard that Loyd has said, "My gift to America's gun owners was Neal Knox." Love him for it, or hate him for it. It's probably true. Loyd's murder, there's an editor's note. Loyd's murderer was eventually caught and convicted. He is now a prisoner in the Texas correctional system. The next one is called Part 2, Principles. There's an editor's note. Neal Knox believed that political strategy must proceed from a set of principles. The pieces included here illustrate some of the key principles he believed and followed, including that the Second Amendment is an insurance policy against a lawless government, that legal controls over inanimate objects affect only those who pay attention to laws, that those who would ban guns will only be satisfied when all guns are banned, that all gun owners need to defend firearms, and that accepting a restrictive law, fearing that worse will be forced down our throat, is a losing strategy. The most important principle is this: where no solid principles exist, everything becomes a bargaining chip. When that happens, the war against gun rights simply becomes a war of attrition, where gun rights will slowly, steadily, and inexorably ratcheted down over a few years. First one in this section. 3 decades later, gun laws still don't work. October 20, 2001. The June and July 1966 Guns and Ammo magazines contained my article challenging Senator Thomas Dodd's, Democrat from Connecticut's, bogus statistical arguments for what eventually became the Gun Control Act of 1968. It was, I believe, the first widely published, footnoted study of the failure of gun laws to reduce crime. As I noted in the article, Senator Dodd has added a new dimension to the old emotional gun control arguments. Statistics purporting to show the availability of guns has a direct relationship on the incidence of crime, particularly murder rates. Sound familiar? I recently reread that piece and decided to reprint it, with permission of Guns and Ammo, and post it on my website, nealknox.com. While the crime statistics have changed, crime, and crime with guns, is far greater despite all the gun laws in the last 3 decades. The principle is just as sound today as they were a third of a century ago. The article shows that anti-gunners' penchant for twisting crime statistics is not a new phenomenon. Neither is the overwhelming hatred of guns and gun owners by the news media a new thing. The press and much of the public were inflamed because of the assassination of President Jack Kennedy with the mail-order Italian Carcano bolt-action rifle, and Officer Tippett, killed during the search for the assassin, was shot with an inexpensive mail-order handgun. During the 1964 and 65 Senate Juvenile Delinquency Committee hearings concerning mail-order guns, surplus imports, and Saturday Night Special handguns, Chairman Dodd, father of the present Senator Christopher Dodd, blistered pro-gun witnesses, particularly NRA Executive Vice President Franklin Orth, the then Guns and Ammo editor Tom Sciotus or something. Dodd accused them of lying about his bill, and the press dutifully parroted his statistical dissertations. The gun-owning public didn't know whom to believe. Dodd and the press had succeeded in the never-ending objective of discrediting the pro-gun leadership. My reason for including footnotes wasn't to make it a scholarly piece, but simply to make it more credible. I had no idea where or if the article would appear, but I wanted to show that every significant statement could be verified so gun owners could quote from the article with confidence. The published version had 40-odd footnotes, about a third longer than the original version. With the benefit of hindsight, some sections are somewhat embarrassingly, particularly my emphasis on hunting and recreational shooting. Though I knew well that the Second Amendment wasn't about preserving guns for sport, I was trying to jar awake the mass of hunters and casual gun owners who were either too oblivious to congressional dangers to their gun rights or utterly convinced that the Supreme Court would strike down any federal gun law on Second Amendment grounds. We still have the same apathy problems now, although far more awake today than in 1966. The basic arguments that I made then are equally valid today, and the evidence just as persuasive. Although, despite the Gun Control Act, gun crime rose to incredible heights over the next quarter century. Irrespective of additional restrictive gun laws, crime rates finally began to recede only when states started locking up violent repeat offenders, as I recommended in 1966. Because of the broad wording of key sections of Dodd's bill, I noted, as NRA Franks Orth had, that regardless how the sponsors claimed the law would be enforced, it would allow regulations that went far beyond its obvious provisions. Sure enough, 10 years after the law passed, when I was the executive director of NRA-ILA, the BATF attempted to rewrite the regulations to create a total registration system. I gingerly mentioned in the 1966 article that during the uproar after the Kennedy assassination, NRA had endorsed the Dodd bill, even after he had amended it to apply to long guns. I was shocked by that endorsement, which I learned about while reading the hearings, particularly since the NRA had led members to believe they were opposing it. The NRA board, after getting hammered by members, rescinded the endorsement a few months later. One outright error in the piece was my claim that congressional committee chairmen usually didn't preside over their own bills, much less badger the bill's opponents. It was and is done that way all the time, but I didn't know that until I had spent some time on Capitol Hill. I got a first-hand taste in early 1967 when, as the editor of Gun Week, I testified against the Dodd bill before Dodd in his Senate subcommittee and before House co-sponsor and Judiciary Committee Chairman Emanuel Seller, another Democrat from New Jersey. I know only one earlier attempt to determine whether gun laws had any relationship to gun crimes. That was an obscure study done in 1960 by a Wisconsin Legislative Reference Library. The Wisconsin legislature, under pressure to enact additional gun laws, had asked their researchers to determine whether new gun laws were likely to have any positive effect. As I wrote in Guns and Ammo, that report, which includes several pages of detailed comparisons of crime to gun laws and other factors, concludes, from the foregoing statistics, it would be difficult to determine the effect that either licensing nor non-licensing of firearms has on the extent of crime in a state, particularly upon the murder rate per 100,000 population. About 1967, that study was replicated and expanded by Dr. A.S. Krug and widely distributed by National Shooting Sports Foundation. My effort was minuscule compared to the massive studies which have followed it, particularly University of Massachusetts, Amherst, scholar sociologist James D. Wright's review, funded with almost $200,000 grant by the Carter administration's Justice Department and grudgingly released by the Reagan Justice Department in 1981. In 1978, ILA's researchers and I had met with Dr. Blair Ewing of the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which conducted criminological research for the Justice Department. I complained that LEAA's research was focused on what type of gun law to pass rather than whether gun laws reduced crime, their ostensible purpose. Because ILA had just succeeded in cutting $4.2 million from BATF's budget for attempting the previous mentioned National Firearms Registration regulations, we had the attention of Washington's bureaucrats, and LEAA was doubly nervous, and their agency was about to be eliminated. As a result of that meeting, and confident that objective research would show the benefits of gun control laws, LEAA granted almost $200,000 to Dr. Wright, a published advocate for gun control laws. To the undoubted surprise and disappointment of his sponsors, Dr. Wright really was objective. He told me several years later that he expected his research to make him the hero of the gun control movement because he expected to determine what type of gun laws was most effective. Instead, he became their goat. Dr. Wright's research found that no gun law or combination of gun laws could be shown to have reduced crime. His book, Under the Gun by Wright, Rossi, and Roll, is based on that earth-shaking study. The next major milepost was Florida State University criminologist Gary Kleck's surveys, which indicate up to 2 million crimes per year are foiled because of self-defense with privately owned guns, most of which never had to be fired. He describes his work in point blank. Like Wright, Kleck's findings were doubly effective because he describes himself as a doctrine liberal. Dr. John Lott's massive 1997 study went the next critical step. He statistically analyzed the crime rates of the 3,000-plus U.S. counties following the passage of concealed carry licensing laws during past 2 decades. After controlling for virtually every conceivable factor, from demographic to imprisonment rates, he showed that arming the citizenry through concealed carry laws had contributed in significant crime reductions. He also predicted the percentage of crime reduction and lives saved if more states passed such laws. And to make his message explicit, he titled his book, More Guns, Less Crime. Dr. Lott's hearsay and his evangelism for concealed carry laws, though he didn't even own a gun when he began his research, has brought him under ferocious personal attack, but his enemies can't challenge his finding, except by twisting the statistics as Tom Dodd pioneered in the 1960s. These 3 landmark studies provide the evidence one could wish that, as I wrote in a third century ago, prohibitive gun legislation has been attempted for half a century. It has not worked. It will not work.
The guys and gals of GunWebsites.com encourage you to take a CCW class every year, practice at least once a month, and carry every day. Thanks for watching GunWebsites.com.